The language itself is a misnomer, but it's not fair because nowhere's a haven. You can't escape climate. Looking at different places in the United States where people had been moving to. So we can think about sending zones and receiving zones. And receiving zones are not climate havens, right? And what I try to do in the book is dispel the mythology of climate havens.
What if migration isn't something that just happens, but something that is made? Welcome to Production Side, the podcast about the societal negotiation of migration. We explore how migration is produced through policies, institutions, and categories. And we ask, what role does migration research itself play in this process?
Welcome to this episode of our podcast. Today, we look at how links between climate change and migration are produced through social processes. My name is Aurora A, and I will be the host for today's episode. I'm a sociologist at Goethe University in Frankfurt and at the Collaborative Research Center Production of Migration here in Osnabrück. I'm a doctoral researcher. I'm working in a project which explores whether and how climate-driven migration is emerging as a new form of migration. Although you might have read or heard about climate migration, it remains pretty unclear whether climate migration will ever emerge as a distinct migration category. At the moment, there is no national or global legal framework for climate migration or the possibility for applying for a climate-specific asylum. However, at the same time, we observe many processes that produce links between climate change and migration in movies, series, books, newspaper articles. But we can at the same time analyze and see processes that destabilize them. Before we start this episode, we need to talk about what we actually mean when we talk about climate-driven migration. We hear about displacements caused by major floods, destruction from wildfires, or ongoing droughts that destroys people's lives and livelihoods. These are ways climate change affects living and maintaining living at a certain place through sudden events, like for example a flood, as well as slow processes like droughts. Here we see that climate change impacts, like the floods that I mentioned, are drivers for migration decisions or other forms that we later will talk about. Very important is that these experience of impacts of climate change depend heavily on their specific social, political, economic, and historical contexts. Vulnerability and the risk of harm from climate change vary greatly depending on living conditions, socio-political structures, and available resources. All these aspects are also tied to violent historical developments such as colonialism, the capitalist economy, processes of globalization, and global power dynamics. So we are in a really complex field. Whether to stay or be forced to leave, the ability to make a voluntary decision is co-produced by available resources and structure conditions. This is why research suggests using the term climate Im/mobilities instead of climate migration, for example. This other term encompasses the various ways people respond both voluntarily and involuntarily, which includes to be trapped at a certain place because you have no resources to voluntarily go, or being displaced so you involuntarily have to go by an extreme event. How we think of a certain place, whether people migrate and we assign them to be refugees due to climate change, or staying at a certain place, is part of what we call the production of migration. In this episode, we therefore aim to slightly shift the common perspective on the nexus of climate change and migration. Instead of focusing on these regions that are often framed as vulnerable and dependent on international support, we turn to a country widely perceived as powerful, industrialized, and economically strong, yet also one of the largest contributors to global carbon emissions. We take a look at the United States of America as a key case for understanding the relationship between climate change and mobility and the production of staying as a form of deproducing migration. We know the US is a major climate emitter because of its oil and gas, big cars, but at the same time, it is also the country that experiences major hurricanes such as Katrina in New Orleans in 2005 and Sandy in New York City in 2011. And both of these hurricanes were public international events which are important for climate change policy in many other countries. To discuss how climate change impact are addressed in this context and how different forms of staying and moving and then getting mobile are shaped under these socioeconomic conditions, I'm joined today by Jesse M. Keenan, an expert on climate change adaptation and mitigation in the US. Jesse is an associate professor of sustainable real estate and urban planning at Tulane University in New Orleans. He recently published the book North, The Future of Post-Climate America, which explores the intermingle of climate change adaptation, migration, and carbon mitigation. After my conversation with Jesse, my dear team colleague Professor Thomas Scheffer, also from the University of Frankfurt, will join me for some reflections. At the beginning of our conversation, I asked Jesse about New Orleans. He has lived there for a while and still works there. I was interested in how a city severely affected by Hurricane Katrina and which is still up to date a climate vulnerable place shapes a researcher's work. Jesse, tell us, how has New Orleans shaped your research on climate change? And maybe also, how does your research shape your being in the city?
Yeah, that's a great question with probably not a terribly rational answer. The first thing I think it's useful for particularly European listeners to contextualize is that over the course of human civilization and thousands of years of human development, people figured out over time where high exposure, high risk places were and are, and they adapt their settlements accordingly. But, in the United States, and New Orleans is a good example of this, European settlement here is less than 500 years old, often less than 250 years old. And so when people moved here, they didn't benefit from that accumulation of indigenous knowledge about where risk and exposure and the machinations of environmental processes in the context of where they decided to build. So in this sense, New Orleans was a strategic defensive, was founded really in the Mississippi River in a swamp in a place that no one should have ever built a city. So a lot of places in the United States have an inordinate level of environmental exposure because they just didn't benefit from this accumulation of knowledge. But to answer your question, just to go back to, how does that shape my work and my research? I was looking to get out of Harvard because they hadn't tenured anybody in my department as a junior faculty this century. And climate change is not really viewed as a popular research theme that would yield get me tenure there. Different universities we looked at around the country, I liked Tulane in a way because it was on the front lines, right? I had worked in the Gulf Coast in and around Hurricane Katrina. I knew the full spectrum of environmental justice in terms of toxic exposure, Cancer Alley. I knew the geography reasonably well, and I knew that it was sinking. New Orleans has approximately annualized sea level rise, mean relative sea level rise of about 15 to 17 millimeters per year, which puts it on one of the most high risk and high exposure, low elevation coastal zones anywhere in the world. I mean, it's up there with Bangladesh, right? But I wanted to kind of be truly on the edge of risk. But I was a little naive on those terms because we had Hurricane Ida. Hit. My wife and I are expecting our first and only child. Things change when you become a parent. Your tolerance for risk and your perception of risk changes, of course. And we're expecting our first child. And then, of course, a hurricane comes and blows off part of our roof. And we basically have to, you need a roof to have a baby. So we end up moving to where we live now in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so I'm sort of keenly aware in many ways of risk and exposure. I've sort of lived it on some level. I actually got the contract to the book North as we were driving over the causeway or over the bridge to the mainland during our evacuation from the hurricane. It's a weird set of circumstances, but I'll say it probably hasn't changed my work. And I don't think it has had a big influence on my work. If it has, I would say it's just given me a sense of the human toll in terms of the stress of what it means to be on the move, at least under conditions of displacement, but also under conditions of elective mobility. That is, when people are, in voluntary terms, thinking about how and where to move, what are all the trade-offs that we make, and what are the range of considerations? Climate's just one of many factors in terms of human mobility. How do we begin to psychologically connect with place? What do we dream about? In terms of the affective reasoning and our emotional connection to where we're going and the fictions that we create. And this is work that's happened in migration studies and in sociology and even in anthropology. But I think I begin to appreciate that line of scholarship and those kind of modes of thinking that move beyond the kind of rational economic orientation that one often has to public policy. And so in that regard, I'm sure it has had some influence along the way.
A hurricane makes climate change feel like a real threat to living. I think this is important to keep in mind for us as researchers dealing with climate change in many ways. We ought not to treat it as too abstract. It can hit us as well, and we might be, as you describe it in the beginning of your book, confronted with the question of where to maintain living in times of climate change. Your book gives the answer: north. Your book and your research in general address adaptation and mitigation, but also the question of becoming mobile, seeking refuge, and seeking more climate-friendly spaces. You see them potentially further north, like the Great Lake regions in the US. This reflects the title of your recent book. In your subtitle, you introduced the terminology post-climate America. This surprised me, actually. How can we think beyond climate? Can you maybe explain to us what you mean by a post-climate America?
So post-climate America, for me, as I set it up, is really, there's sort of no need to over-intellectualize it, and that's probably my tendency. But in its simplest form is a state where climate change is fully internalized into everything that we do, right? Not just as a challenge or as a risk, but actually indeed as an opportunity as well. Because there's tremendous opportunities that come with climate change to fix many problems which happen to be carbon intensive, which segregate our society, which create cost burdens, which make us have trade-offs between energy and healthcare, or filling up the car with gas and education or medicine. So there's all these trade-offs, and there's all of these benefits that we have through decarbonization and through broader societal adaptations. And for me, a post-climate world is one from which climate is not a peripheral issue of policy to be debated as to in what direction we go. It's been internalized in the psyche of American society and into our everyday way of life. And to me, that is post-climate America.
What do our more European listeners maybe have to know about the specific US conditions, especially at this nexus of climate change, adaptation, and migration?
Yeah, so in the book North, I really wanted to write the book as an accessible outline for adaptation science. We really haven't had a definitive book on adaptation science in the English language. And so what I wanted to do is to outline the science of adaptation, but also the policy and institutions of adaptation that are, in fact, unique to the United States. One, we have inordinate amounts of exposure in terms of everything: extreme heat, extreme precipitation, or the risk of extreme precipitation, flash flooding, sea level rise, subsidence, landslides. What we see in the United States is the areas that generally tend to be at most at risk or have the highest concentration of exposure are generally in the areas with the fastest population growth in the last 2 generations. So much of the country, internal migration from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s moved from basically the north and the northeast to the south, what we call the Sun Belt, basically going from the Carolinas all the way over to Southern California. And so we've been concentrating our population and our economic growth in increasingly high-risk areas. So over time, the institutions of government have largely focused on post-disaster response in institutions. So we have things like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We have U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have only in the past 15 to 20 years begin to think about pre-disaster mitigation or hazard mitigation. And only in the past 10 years have we really become more serious about broader adaptation and thinking about multi-sector adaptation across infrastructure, across agriculture, financial, across the full spectrum of sectors in the United States, have we really begun the process of thinking about adaptation and policy and planning accordingly. So it's, and in that sense, just to give you, I went to school in Europe and studied and worked in Europe as well. I would say the United States is a full 10 to 15 years behind, at least, advancements that we've seen particularly among EU member countries in adaptation policy and planning. And of course, we're falling way behind now with the dissolution and destruction of an enormous amount of federal infrastructure, and mostly the firing of personnel that are the key continuity from one presidential administration to the other in developing not just the policy, but developing the expertise that it takes to reach the full depth of these sectors.
And before we talk a bit more about the political conditions of the current times we live in, I have one more question, because also you focus on real estate. I wonder how the American dream and the idea of having a house and having a place to live and raise your children is kind of also a shaping factor in the question how climate change impacts adaptation and also maybe mobility forms are shaped in the US, that there's a specificity with the American.
Yeah. I mean, so to understand the American dream, just for listeners who may not be familiar with this is a deep-rooted fiction that created the idea of the American consumer. And the idea of the American consumer, following the Great Depression of the 1920s into the 1930s, and certainly after the post-war period of the 1940s, was that the government would amortize long-term mortgage debt. What happens in the United States is basically the government amortizes long-term debt in order to free up the income and expenditures of consumers so that they can go out and buy things in the economy and grow the economy. So 2/3 of our economy, even today, is just people buying stuff. It's consumption, right? This is one of the reasons we're so carbon intensive. So we create the consumer, and the American dream is this idea that people own property, they own land, they own their housing, and they have a little white picket fence, and their kids ride their bikes to school, and they everybody lives as a single family unit, in the kind of Judeo-Christian sense of America. It's a husband and a wife and 2.5 kids, right? So we've created this fiction, 250 years of a fiction of what it means to how we should live, where we should live, and how we should invest capital. And so that in many ways has been much bigger than climate, because the way the role that the government plays in financing it and paying for housing it includes some, but excludes a good number of people, right? We've run out of infrastructure supported land, so we've borrowed a lot of money in the municipal bond market to build housing. But what the bottom line is that housing cost burdens have gone up. And part of these cost burdens are being now, of course, in recent years, being driven by climate change, specifically as it relates to insurance. This is the canary in the coal mine. This is what people feel first, is the insurance side of things. And we've had significant insurance losses, and that has had massive inflation in the price and cost of insurance for American homeowners. And so, much of my career has been to talk about climate change and research climate change, but really communicate climate change, not as a moralization, because it's easy to moralize climate change, right? And I'm sure I'm guilty of that sometimes myself. But really to say, hey, this is a basic economic issue. This is an issue that resonates with American households. It impacts your monthly budget. It impacts your life savings. It impacts your accumulation of wealth and your quality of life. We don't have to moralize the right or wrong of climate change. What we need to look at is how it shapes your life and your daily life. That's what I I would say, pioneered on some level as a form of communication in the United States and a body of research. So the American dream becomes a vehicle to communicate climate change.
Yeah. Regarding the housing aspect that we just talked about, I think it is important to talk about the injustices that are created and that are also part of the fiction of the American way of living with the American dream and the house, that injustices are in some senses escalating because of climate change impacts. And maybe you can say a bit more about that, because I think climate change injustices is on a local level, but also on a global level, a very important aspect in the climate changing world.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I would use the language of injustice, because the system was designed, that is the capitalist system of what we have in the United States, was designed to create inequalities, right? The system and the mode of regulation, institution, law, and policy doesn't provide provision for equal allocations of resources. What it's largely focused in on is procedural due process and procedural justice, in the sense that it has on its surface a kind of egalitarian ambition, but of course it results in disproportionate burdens on certain types of populations. So I think what I recognize in my book and try to document empirically is that certain populations bear certain types of burdens in terms of income inequality, by income, race, class, however you want to look at it. And that disproportionate burdens, particularly as it relates to just income inequality, and class disparity and segregation and race segregation, are going to be exacerbated by climate, right? My critique of the left in the normative side of social justice is not the same thing as the critique of this is actually, that in many ways they're actually fundamentally right on a lot of these things, which is that when we correct off these fundamental climate problems, or we address them and we adapt to things, we have the opportunity to address a lot of allied social conditions to bring people up. They're 100% correct about that. What I think they've lost is how you communicate that.
Yeah.
Because they've kind of moralized it in a way and communicated it in a way that prioritizes some populations over others without communicating how and why that is. And so it becomes a kind of binary identification that some populations bear, burden and responsibility, and some should be blamed, and it becomes a kind of theological disposition to argue that some will be saved and some will be damned. And I think there's a different way to communicate that brings in a much broader community and diversity of people into the mix who see it slightly differently in terms of who bears the responsibilities and who bears the burdens. But I think as empirical social scientists or research scholars, we have an obligation to say, yeah, there are people who bear enormous burdens here, and that we as a society should have laws and policies that help people, that help bring up the quality of life in their basic existence to a level which is humane.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge. And that's not an easy one so I think a lot of this is not that people are factually inaccurate. It's that it's how we choose to communicate and how we choose to build coalitions. And I don't think you build coalitions of people around climate by so explicitly choosing some people over other people and excluding others. I think the whole idea is to include people, not to exclude people. And by the way, that means including rich people in the conversation, right? Which is like, by the way, because the rich people are the ones that often control the capital. I'm not saying I'm right or, necessarily right or wrong, but I think that this is where climate communications and climate research really needs to go to build a bigger tent.
Yeah.
And it can't just be about social justice, as I see it. It's too small of a narrow issue politically.
Yeah, I think for climate communication, the wording and also the choice of terminology are really crucial aspects. I want to discuss this a bit more with you at the moment. I noticed throughout your work that the shaping of new terms is something important to you. And I want to start with a term that received widespread media attention, climate haven. In 2018, journalist Oliver Millman used the term safe haven in his article, Where Should You Move to Save Yourself from Climate Change? The term safe haven was picked up by the media and fabricated into a media construct now coined as climate havens. Since this article, this term is often associated with you and your work, on the one hand, because Millman interviewed and cited you in this article, and on the other, you also engage with this term, but also with its development and its problems in your book. For our listeners, maybe to frame what actually climate haven means, it is supposed to be a climate-safe place in the US. Even a real estate firm compiled a list of 19 cities, including, for example, Portland, Maine, and Buffalo, New York. And we can say for Buffalo, for example, they're even using the frame climate haven in their city marketing to attract new people to move there. This list was pretty shaken up in 2024. One of the cities of the list, Asheville, in September 2024, was severely hit and destroyed by Hurricanes Helene's extreme rainfalls and flooding. Afterwards, newspapers proclaimed there's no such thing as a climate haven. The example of Asheville shows how powerful terms can be, but also how they are challenged by reality, either matching or mismatching. Jesse, how do you deal with this ambivalence and challenge? Tell us a bit more how you work with terms in your research.
I did not coin the term safe havens or climate havens. I have propagated and advanced ideas like climate gentrification, like blue lining, and I think my goal was that I saw something that was new and different, that was a new form of behavior, and that it needed to stand out. And people needed to recognize this as something that doesn't follow the sort of conventional patterns of how we understand social behavior or economics or whatever, and that we needed to use a language that people could relate to. So gentrification was kind of a language that people sort of intuitively understand. So in this sense, climate gentrification is something that people just can grasp onto. So I'm taking the idea of the familiar, and by the way, blue lining is very similar to red lining. It's something everybody not everybody, a lot of people understand its historical legacy. And by the way, there are connections between blue lining and red lining, as I talked about in the book. But these are things that people have a familiarity to. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to say, listen, there are these processes and things that shape our world, and now they're just slightly different. Climate alters those understandings in a pretty fundamental way. And so I think how we construct the language is really important. Now, I want to talk about Asheville for a second. What myself and colleagues have been doing over the years is looking at different places in the United States where people had been moving to. So we can think about sending zones and receiving zones. And receiving zones are not climate havens, right? And what I try to do in the book is dispel the mythology of climate havens, right? Because the language itself is a misnomer, but it's also, it's not fair because nowhere's a haven. You can't escape climate, right? And Asheville's a really good example of this because in Asheville, there's this, many people had been moving there because of climate was a major influence. Climate is very rarely the singular influence, but it had most certainly been a major influence. And for those of you who are listeners who may not appreciate this, Asheville's up in the mountains of North Carolina. It's cooler up there. It's once you go down closer to the coast, it's much more hot and humid. But up in the mountains, they tend to get a little bit more rain. It tends to be cooler. It's just nicer weather. I would say in general, it's not so hot. And so people had been moving there, and of course they have the big flood. And the big flood knocks out power and infrastructure for a few months, and it knocks out some places that historically had pretty consistently flooded in the past. But if there's one thing we know about Asheville, one thing we know about American post-disaster redevelopment is that Asheville will only continue to grow as a receiving zone. People will move there. In fact, what's going to happen and what's already happening is they'll just go in and tear down what was flooded in Asheville, and they will regrade the lots. They will fill in with dirt and rock and soil, and they will elevate things. They will design buildings with engineering resilience techniques and materials. So for instance, the first floor will be designed to be flooded, and that'll just be a garage, so you're not really damaging much of their home. And they will develop at higher densities and at higher price points, and to accommodate a greater population load in these areas. And so we use engineering resilience as a form of amenity to rationalize the intensity of redevelopment. And by the way, they will sell these homes at price points that were many times higher than what was flooded in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's already happening. Asheville will only continue to grow as a receiving zone.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to recognize that, there is no climate havens. One of the things I talk about in the book is like, well, why does climate havens appear? Where does it come from? Well, it turns out it comes from journalists or people writing, and they sort of misunderstand the scholarship, and they misunderstand what people have been talking about, and they intentionally use a very inflammatory rhetorical vehicle in the language of a haven as a kind of joke in a way, but then people end up taking it seriously. People are desperate for optimism.
Yeah.
They're desperate to have some agency over their capacity to make decisions in an otherwise totally chaotic world. And they're looking for something. And that feels very utopian in a sense, but it also, I think, needs to be recognized is a powerful vehicle for social change.
Yeah.
That people still retain a sense of optimism. They might get the language wrong, but they still want to live in a world where they can have a sustainable footprint and a sustainable way of life. And so for as much as I look down on that language, I think it's something we also have to understand why and how that language perpetuates.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying this. I think this is especially what I wanted to talk about first, to see how a term can be twisted around and then picked up by public or media public, and can be created in a certain, maybe you can call it an imaginary in the sense, which has then also a powerful influence on maybe investors or decision-making processes. And I think it's also a good example, what I like to end with you in the end, that we tend maybe to look at contexts like the US or also Europe, especially Northern Europe, the rich industrial areas, as more the areas that can be rebuilt and can be adapted and can be places for a future living. If we look from the global scale, we have more imaginaries from what the climate immobilities research field has shown us, that there's an imaginary of people will migrate and there will be relocations, and not so much talking about adaptation. I wonder how you look at this discourse, and maybe you can touch upon the differences also in the discourse from this global perspective on what we maybe call global north and global south differences.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I'm fully in tune with the global scholarship on this. I will say that from a disciplinary point of view, a lot of what we've seen globally is coming from migration studies. And so there's a very narrow cohort that people tend to study and evaluate. And that's a cohort of the dispossessed and the displaced. But I think what is sort of unique in the global north, Europe and the United States, is that there's a broader cohort here. And I talk about this in the book. On some level, yes, there are people that are being forced out and they're being pushed out, right? And they lose a home or a way of life or whatever it means. But on the other end of the continuum, we have people who are electively mobile. We have people with the wealth, the skills, the labor capacity, and the choice and the opportunity to be mobile. And this is certainly true all throughout Europe with the freedom of movement in Europe. I think that's what's unique a little bit in the United States and in Europe, and particularly in the United States, is that we see a lot more different types of people on the move now. It's not just the old-fashioned way of thinking, not the old-fashioned, but the kind of more narrow perspective that people are of lesser means that have been forced by some exploitive global capitalist system and are being dispossessed and displaced. Those people certainly exist by the hundreds of millions. But there's also other populations out there who have some choice or are making choices by virtue of their disproportionate position of being privileged with living in these countries of wealth, who are also on the move. And that is a very valuable thing to understand and to learn, because it gives us a sense of the scale and the movement of not just people, but the movement of capital, and how, and for better or for worse, right? Mm-hmm. To prepare in many ways, as I argue, for this movement, so that next time we don't just perpetuate carbon intensive suburban segregating sprawl. We actually think about how we can do this the right way, to take advantage, to de-risk and decarbonize our society, and to advance those of lesser means, to bring everyone up in the advance of a quality of life and our stewardship of the environment. This is what's at stake.
Yeah, we see many existential problems overlapping in the times we do research in at the moment. Some call it a polycrisis, which also pushes the post-climate era, where climate change is not a problem, but more part of the structure, or part of yes. Everything we do, as you explained in the beginning. It's pushing at us for more into the future, and hopefully is still in a way we can imagine it realizable in the sense.
Yeah, we have all the tools we need in terms of technology and policy. What we need, I think your use of the imaginary is spot on. What we need is to inspire people that there is a way out, and there is a better life ahead for people. Yeah. That's all people want. Yeah. It's just genetically encoded in our ambition for the perpetuation of our species.
And find ways in an inclusive way to not produce fictions again that to exclude certain people.
We could only survive as a species of groups. The anthropologists have long taught us this. So we have to work together. There's no alternative. I mean, forget institutions and organizations for a second. Like, at a really basic level, we are genetically encoded to operate in the collective. And that's the only way out of this.
Yeah. Thank you. There was a wonderful last word, I would say, that brings us or gives us some, I think you called it vision earlier, some vision how we can move forward to a post-climate America, as you coined it. Thank you so much for joining this episode today. After speaking with Jesse M. Keenan about his research in the US on adaptation and different forms of mobilities, I'm very happy to welcome now Professor Thomas Scheffer. Thomas Scheffer is professor for sociology with an emphasis on interpretative social research. And Thomas and I work together at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, as well as in the so-called C5 project here at the CRC 1604 in Osnabrück. And we are interested in the question how climate-induced migration is produced and negotiated. What are key insights that you take away from the interview for our own research and also for our perspective on the reflexive migration production perspective?
Hello, Aurora. Thank you for having me. What I really liked is that in the interview, climate change is everywhere, and it is dictating the pace of us trying to adapt to it, trying to build it into our everyday affairs. A second point, what I learned was to really think about climate-induced migration not as an either-or question, but that this kind of climate-induced migration has a before and after. It is growing into time and growing into space. I think that is, for our own research, really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. So, for example, with the climate refugee category, would say whether there is a climate refugee or there is not. This would be either or perspective. But with this more process perspective that you just formulated, that we also have in our research, is that there are certain stages of development that we can observe. So it's kind of everywhere, and it's all readjusting towards a climate change future and also present. With the US, and I think that's also something we can take away from the interview, that the American dream and also the housing or the insurance for the housing has a specific importance for the US case. And we can learn from that in different contexts, certain aspects where climate change enters the field can be a vehicle for communicating climate change and produce a certain narrative about climate change.
Yeah, definitely. What we learn is that it matters a lot from where you observe and from where you experience those changes. So the capacity of the society to help out or to step in, to serve as a kind of buffer is really important. And that is definitely something that on a global scale is not equally allocated. If you are lucky and you are in a very prosperous state, climate-induced migration is further away from your lived reality.
Yeah, I think you're touching upon a very important topic. And I think it's the big question about global inequalities and how do we deal with them, and also how do we describe them as social researchers. And I think what you just said with the buffer is a very important aspect, because it signals how important specific or also different resources can distance climate change as everyday problem. One thing I would like to talk about with you is the production of narratives that comes up in the interview. The emphasis on economic issues that Jessie really brought up in talking about housing, how can climate change as a problem be communicated, and that it needs to be something that people feel in their everyday lives. So if the insurance is getting higher and higher because of climate change impacts, you feel it. What this is interesting, that this is a very specific way of addressing climate change as a basic economic problem.
I have to say I like his take on it very much. It is important to choose that as a level of telling the story, because it is about continuation despite all ruptures. We all need to translate even the biggest issues in our everyday affairs, paying for the insurance, making the experience that the bill is getting higher and higher. That is one of those many translations. That is how it becomes real at the same time.
When I would now take the perspective of climate justice, this would be a different perspective. How would you see this in relation to the economic argument?
In a way, social justice and climate justice are the same, and they are different at the same time. In political debates, especially on the left, it is often the confusion that one would say, yeah, you are interested in climate change, but not in the social question. The thing is with climate change that it is radicalizing the social question. They become one because all the free goods we forgot about, air and water, the stable climate as such, they are put into question. And who suffers most are those people who cannot replace the free goods by commodities. On the other hand, I think we need to get used to the fact that climate justice and social justice work differently because different stuff is involved. That is probably a story that is more complicated, that we rely on our wealth being protected and being available as well in the future, whereas climate change put into question the very institutions that safeguard this wealth and this capital. The state itself, the national bank, the financial system, that are social institutions as well. And it is not natural given that your money that you have in your bank account secures your future living.
It's not so much about different narratives that we can either choose economic narrative on climate change or a social justice narrative, but it's more important also for our production perspective that these aspects, they come together and they have maybe different angles. However, they are interconnected, interlinked. And maybe this is also something when we talk about the question of communicating about climate change and communication strategies is that our role as social researchers is to stand for this complexity and break it down and explain it in the sense how these complexities work.
What easily happens is when we talk about climate change that we escape into narratives that are linked to our stable past. We try to translate it into stories where our money, our houses, our cars provide for stability, while we have to learn, on the other hand, that through climate change, there are no longer the safe havens. There is then a rising sense, a rising atmosphere of insecurity. That is a difficult task for us as social researchers.
What we can say is that this perspective with stability on our context is also vice versa. The perspective of certain regions have been unstable all the time. What we often call the global south is more vulnerable. And I think that these categories, either are stable or unstable, is also something that needs to be complexified and that we need to take serious in injustices or inequalities in terms of the buffers we talked about. I think this is really a takeaway from this interview also in our work. And now at the end, I would like to ask you if there's one takeaway that you take away from the interview for the further work on the production of climate-induced migration.
The takeaway for me is that we probably need to be more radical in our thinking, that we need to complicate our concept that we were brought up with as sociologists, all the resources we have. We need to be able to somehow question them in the light of the fundamental changes we live through.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for your inspiring insights.
Thank you, Aurora.
Thank you for listening to Production Side, the podcast about the societal negotiation of migration. If this episode made you think, subscribe and spread the word. You can find all credits, sources and further links in the show notes and at producingmigration.org. Production Side is produced by the Collaborative Research Center Production of Migration at Osnabrück University, funded by the German Research Foundation in collaboration with Podcast Fabrik Bielefeld. New episodes are available wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, and until then, what's being produced right now?